The PlayStation 3. It was Sony's lowest-selling home console, widely seen as an over-engineered, overpriced, difficult-to-develop-for console brought on by Sony's arrogance and dismissal of not only their competition, but their fans as well. But is all that really true? Was it really that expensive? Yeah, it was. But was it really all that bad, or was there more to the story?
Well, let's once again pop off those rose-tinted glasses because, well, you know, examine the details and take an unbiased look at the PlayStation 3. Good God, this thing's heavy. And see if it really was all that bad, or if we all just needed to learn to play beyond. Before we go beyond, let's take a look back at the history.
Sony had seen great success with its PlayStation 2 in the 6th generation, dominating its competition Nintendo, newcomer Microsoft, and being the main contributor to ending gaming giant Sega's run in the home console business. And by dominated, I mean absolutely obliterated, with its closest competitor being Microsoft's original Xbox coming in at 24 million units sold, which isn't too shabby for a first-time American console maker, but pales in comparison to the PS2's ridiculous 155 million units sold.
Damn, that's a lot.
In fact, Sony had destroyed its competition for 2 generations straight now. And with Sega out of the game, Nintendo seemingly not knowing what the hell they were doing at this point, and newcomer Microsoft just, well...
I mean, it's just Microsoft. What are they gonna do, right?
Sony had their sights set on repeating this dominance for a third time. On March 9th, 2001, president of Sony Interactive Entertainment and the father of the PlayStation, Ken Kutaragi, announced a collaboration between Sony, Toshiba, and IBM known as STI.
Didn't think that one all the way through, did they?
To develop a new revolutionary microprocessor to rival all others called the Cell. The Cell/BE, or as it's commonly called, Cell processor was in fact a hell of a piece of engineering, containing the ability to outperform similar processors. But this engineering marvel was also its biggest problem. You see, the Cell was over-engineered, and due to a bevy of reasons, such as favoring peak computational throughput over the simplicity of program code, made it widely regarded as difficult to develop for.
And if you know what favoring peak computational throughput over the simplicity of program code means, then why are you watching YouTube? You should be doing better things with your life.
All that being said, Sony saw this as an opportunity to be at the forefront of technology for the next generation and went ahead with the Cell processor at the heart of the PlayStation 3. After a fairly uneventful development period, Sony officially unveiled the PlayStation 3 on May 16th, 2005 at that year's E3 Expo. The prototype featured 2 HDMI ports, because why not, 3 Ethernet ports for those of us that have 3 different internet providers, and 6 USB ports so you can plug up your 2 controllers, printer, fans, PSP, and hot plate for your coffee all at the same time, I guess. Also unveiled with the PS3 was its new controller, the 6-axis, which would be replacing the DualShock line.
Which was a different take from what we have gotten from Sony up to this point, but more on that in a bit.
Sony also showed off some video that was based on predicted PS3 specifications, most notably a CGI shot-for-shot remake of the opening to Final Fantasy VII. These predictions were a bit generous to say the least, but that wasn't the first or the last time Sony had done this. A year and one competitor's console launch later, the PlayStation 3's final form was shown off at the 2006 E3 Expo.
And this is where the problems began.
Understandably, the final model reduced its inputs down to 1 HDMI port, 1 Ethernet port, and while still a bit over the top, 4 USB ports to cut production costs, and because, you know,
who the hell needs all that?
Similar to Microsoft with its Xbox 360, Sony announced 2 versions of the PS3 for launch. The full-featured premium 60GB model and the base-level 20GB model that would not have an HDMI port, Wi-Fi, the ever-important flashcard readers, and some other premium physical bells and whistles. The boomerang controller design that had been mocked for a year had also been, thankfully, dropped in favor of a more familiar design. Pretty much the same exact design as the 2 previous generations. The DualShock, however now named the 6-axis.
But hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Yeah, we'll get to it.
The PS3's worldwide, pretty much, simultaneous release date was also announced for November 11th, 2006 in Japan, and a week later on November 17th in the US and Europe, putting it releasing a full year after its main competitor, Microsoft's Xbox 360. Sony also made the bold, and some would say arrogant, claim that the HD generation wouldn't begin until the PlayStation 3 release, in regard to Microsoft's Xbox 360 being the first HD console. This presumptuous and arrogant take didn't sit well with many consumers.
Then came the biggest hit and possibly Sony's most blatant display of how out of touch they have become with their consumers: the price.
In what could ironically be described as the opposite of the $299 bombshell that Sony dropped on Sega 10 years earlier at E3 95,
$299.
Sony announced the price of the 20 and 60 gigabyte PS3s at $499 and $599 US respectively. For comparison, the Xbox 360 launched at $299 and $399 US. That puts each comparative 360 model $200 cheaper than their PS3 variant, and the entry-level 360 at half the price of the premium PS3, a full year earlier. To say that this price didn't go over well with, well, anybody is putting it mildly. Things weren't looking too hot for Sony's new console at this point, but if you ask them, they seemed unfazed, saying that if you want a premium product, you gotta pay a premium price.
Sure, let me know how that works out.
To make things worse, on September 6, 2006, just 2 months before the worldwide release was scheduled, Sony announced that the European and all other PAL regions' launch was being delayed 4 months to March 2007, citing a shortage of Blu-ray drive materials as the reason. This also didn't go over well with consumers. To lighten the blow, at the Tokyo Game Show a couple of weeks later, Sony announced that the 20GB entry-level PS3 would now also include an HDMI port, just not one that people in PAL regions could use until March.
At this point, the general public's perception of the PS3 wasn't what one would call great, and while there was interest there, it wasn't where Sony wanted it. However, that's something a well-placed, intriguing ad campaign to generate interest pre-launch could take care of. And that's exactly what Sony didn't do.
What we got instead was a truly odd set of ads featuring the PS3 as a 2001 A Space Odyssey-esque monolith, accompanied by weird things like a Rubik's Cube, ooze, eggs, and a really disturbing baby. While the ads were attention-getting, they didn't leave people wanting a PS3. They left people saying,
"What the f is this?"
There's odd and intriguing to get people's attention, and then there's whatever the hell they did here. What they did do, though, is fail to generate any more real interest in the console.
So Sony was coming off a hell of a winning streak with the previous 2 generations, and had developed a technically impressive piece of hardware. But they had really started to make some very anti-consumer decisions. They were making arrogant comments and seemed to be out of touch with their consumer. And all this before the new console was even out. All that being said, Sony was now ready to release its next behemoth on the masses. But were the masses interested in what Sony was offering this time around? Well, ready or not, we're gonna find out as we take a look at
the launch. The PS3 released in Japan on November 11th, 2006, moving 81,639 systems. That's very specific, in the first 24 hours, which is about 0.06% of the country's entire population at the time. So, not too shabby.
Or is it? More in a bit.
It released with 5 games: Genji, Days of the Blade, Mobile Suit Gundam, Target in Sight, Resistance, Fall of Man, Ridge Racer 7, and Sega Golf Club. None of which reviewed particularly well, though Resistance and Ridge Racer did okay. That being said, Ridge Racer is the only one that sold much of anything in the market. Overall, the system had a fairly lukewarm release in its home country, selling a pretty good number of consoles, though not moving much in the software department. The console released about a week later in North America on November 17th, 2006, and while exact sales numbers are scarce, it is known that it did sell out of the region's allotted 400,000 units in the first few days. And hats off to those 400,000 warriors out there that acquired those early systems.
Because things got crazy.
While previous generations had had their launch day shenanigans for sure, this was the generation when the US population lost their f***ing minds. Much like the launch of the 360 and the Wii, violent acts surrounding this plastic box ran rampant, including, but not limited to, shootings, campers being robbed at gunpoint, a 60-person brawl over 10 systems, 2 GameStop employees fabricating a robbery to cover up the fact that they had stolen several systems themselves, drive-by shootings at launch events,
with BB guns,
and much more. To say the launch events of this generation were absolute pandemonium is putting it mildly, and unfortunately, this has become the norm now.
And we wonder why online shopping has taken over.
The system released with 13 games in the US. Resistance, Fall of Man, Tony Hawk's Project 8, Madden, NFL 07, Tiger Woods, PGA Tour 07, Marvel, Ultimate Alliance, NBA 07, NBA 2K7, NHL 2K7, Untold Legends, Dark Kingdom, Ridge Racer 7, Call of Duty 3, Mobile Suit Gundam Crossfire, and Genji Days of the Blade, with a few more releasing a few days later. While the number of release titles was impressive, it was lacking one important component. None of them were killer apps or system sellers. That's not to say that all was bad. There were some solid games, such as Resistance, Marvel Ultimate Alliance, Call of Duty 3, and Ridge Racer 7, but none of them were setting the world on fire.
Overall, violence notwithstanding, the North American launch of the PS3 was pretty good, but maybe not worth catching a bullet over.
1 week later, the console released in Europe. Oh wait, never mind. The last-minute European delay of the console to March 2007 went over about as well as to be expected, with many having already secured pre-orders with deposits, now to be told that they had to wait another 4 months. Due to this backlash, Sony did offer full refunds to those that desired it, which, sounds great and all, but let's be real, they didn't want to, they kinda had to. All that being said, the console would finally release in Europe on March 23rd, 2007.
And the price of this thing was all over the place.
The base model 20GB PS3 launched at £425 in the UK, putting it approximately $40 more than the US release. When asked why this was, Sony cited a value-added tax, whatever the hell that means. Even worse, the continental European price, aka most of the rest of Europe, was €599, being approximately $150 more than the US release. And even worse yet, the people of Ireland caught the ultimate prison shower assault of all, with the console coming in at a monstrous €629, which is approximately $180 more than the US release.
So yeah, with the amount of extra money they were charging for this thing in some regions, you could almost buy a Wii along with your PS3 in other markets.
Apparently though, Europe got some rich mofos, because despite ludicrous pricing, the console sold a whopping 600,000 units in the first 2 days on the European market, becoming the fastest selling home console in UK history at the time with 165,000 of those units. Now on the flip side of that, system sales did drop a massive 82% to 30,000 units sold in the second week. And while that is a pretty substantial drop, one does have to take into consideration launch window shortages. But yeah, that's a pretty big drop. The console launched with a massive 24 games in Europe. Blazing Angels, Squadrons of World War II, Def Jam Icon, the awesome Fight Night Round 3, Enchanted Arms, Formula 1 Championship Edition, Full Auto 2, Battle Lines, MotoStorm, NBA Street Home Court, Need for Speed Carbon, Sonic the Hedgehog, aka Sonic 06, Tekken 5, Dark Resurrection, The Godfather, The Don's Edition, Splinter Cell Double Agent, Virtua Fighter 5, Virtua Tennis 3, as well as many of the games that released in the US. This is the most robust of the PS3 launch lineups, which it should be, seeing as how they had an extra 4.5 months worth of releases to choose from.
And it's far from bad, but much like other regions' launch lineups, there's just not anything here that's selling systems.
Now the system's launch was a particular huge success in the Australian and New Zealand market, selling just shy of 32,000 units in its first 10 days of release, which in comparison to other markets doesn't sound like a lot, but considering the smaller size of the Australian-New Zealand market, it's pretty damn big. Unlike other markets, not only did the system itself do well, but PS3 software sales were through the roof, placing 9 of the top 10 games sold for the week, prompting Daniel Morse of Data Trackers GFK to comment that the PlayStation 3 created a spike in retail spending not previously witnessed at the launch of any other system in Australia. So overall, the launch of the PS3 was pretty successful. It wasn't setting the world on fire, but it was selling out of its available units, and interest was definitely there. However, that is the launch period, and most systems do well during this period.
So the true test would come after launch, when consumers as a whole got their hands on this thing. And to say that Sony wasn't prepared for what was to come is an understatement. So would the PS3 live up to the legacy of the mighty PS2? Was Sony right with their talk of premium consoles and prices and starting the HD era? Would this monolith of a console take over like the previous 2 generations? Well, we're gonna find out as we take a look at
the reception. Reviews of the PS3 were, let's say, not as glowing as Sony would have liked. Most were critical of its high price, lack of quality games, and the fact that game developers said that it was very difficult to program for. Ars Technica gave the PS3 a 6 out of 10. IGN ranked it as only the 15th best gaming console of all time, behind both the Wii at 10th and the Xbox 360 at 6th. PC World awarded the PlayStation 3 the number 8 spot on its list of the top 21 tech screw-ups of 2006, where they said it was late, expensive, and incompatible. Now, Games Radar listed the PS3 at the number 1 spot of game-related PR disasters, asking how Sony was able to take one of the most anticipated game systems of all time and, within the space of a year, turn it into a hate object reviled by the entire internet. The general consensus was that the hardware was pretty cool and had a lot of potential, but due to it being generally difficult to work with, the quality of the games at that point was severely lacking.
And that price really didn't help.
However, much like its forebear, the PS2 with DVD, it was commended for including the newest media platform around in Blu-ray, and at an affordable, relatively speaking, price. Now, due to high production costs, PlayStation 3s were sold at an estimated $300 loss each, depending on which version, which probably greatly contributed to Sony's game division posting a $1.97 billion with a B dollar loss in the fiscal year ending March 2007. The following month, in April 2007, president of Sony Computer Entertainment, Ken Kutaragi, aka the father of the PlayStation, announced his plans to retire, with many news outlets reporting that this was due to the poor sales of the PS3.
Which realistically, it probably was.
Though not surprisingly, Sony denies this, claiming that Kutaragi had been planning his retirement for 6 months. In a move to reduce production costs, shortly after the system's launch, Sony made the decision to remove the Emotion Engine chip, i.e. the PS2 hardware of the system, and card readers from the premium 60GB models. This, coupled with falling internal hardware costs of the system, brought the production cost down considerably, which is great, right?
Well, if you thought any of those savings would be passed on down to the consumer, then you, my friend, were about to be very disappointed.
Though the system was considerably cheaper to produce now, the insanely high price would remain the same, and the quality of the games didn't really change either. Worse yet, multi-platform games routinely ran considerably better on the Xbox 360's less powerful hardware. And if you wanted to rub some more salt on those wounds, the removal of the Emotion chip didn't just cut costs, it also cut native PS2 backwards compatibility. Now, Sony did say that they had plans to institute backwards compatibility through software emulation, which they did, but it took a while, and it never really came anywhere near the almost 100% compatibility of the original launch PS3s, making those original back-compat fat models worth a decent amount nowadays, if you can find one that's working. But as with many things, more on that in a bit.
News outlets weren't the only ones weighing in on Sony's new behemoth. Some industry veterans also had some things to say, and it wasn't pretty.
Bobby Kotick, then Activision Blizzard CEO and all-around beloved guy, said of the PS3, "I'm getting concerned about Sony. The PlayStation 3 is losing a bit of momentum, and they don't make it easy for me to support the platform."
Damn, Bobby, tell us how you really feel. Oh, you're not done.
It's expensive to develop for the console, and the Wii and Xbox are just selling better. Games generate a better return on investment capital on the Xbox than on the PlayStation. Kotick also went as far as to say that if things didn't change, Activision Blizzard could stop supporting the system.
Damn!
The fun for Sony didn't end there though, because famed founder of Valve and overall beloved father of Steam, Gabe Newell, had a few comments as well. "The PS3 is a total disaster on so many levels. I think it's really clear that Sony lost track of what customers and the developers wanted."
And when quite possibly the most beloved person in the gaming industry says that about your new system, it ain't good. But it got worse, because Gaben had more to say.
I'd say even at this late date, they should just cancel it and do a do-over. Just say, "This was a horrible disaster and we're sorry and we're going to stop selling this and stop trying to convince people to develop for it."
Double damn!
To say that Sony was getting the ever-living shit kicked out of them is, well, yeah, that's about right. That's what was happening. And unfortunately, things would continue on this way for a few years. While there were price drops over the next few years and a bevy of different storage size models coming and going, the console remained the most expensive option of the big three, Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo, by quite a bit. The console remained difficult to develop for, and while there were some hits, overall the games just weren't standing up to the competition, and consumers were speaking with their wallets. Because the PS3 was being outsold by its competition by a healthy margin. But worse yet was the public perception of the PlayStation brand at this point. The once gaming giant that couldn't be touched,
"Can't touch this,"
was now a bit of a laughingstock.
Sony's arrogance had caught up to them, and it seemed like it was the end. They had flown too close to the sun, and while they burned bright for a time, now it seemed like they were just burning out. But then, something happened. Actually, a lot of somethings happened.
In 2009, Sony began an ad campaign featuring the character Kevin Butler, who was the vice president of several fictitious departments within PlayStation. These proved very popular to the point where some believed that Butler actually was one of the execs within Sony. Kevin Butler is played by an actor named Jerry Lambert, who has absolutely no affiliation with Sony beyond this role, by the way. These ads gave the PlayStation 3 a boost in sales that it sorely needed, but it was August of that same year when things truly turned around, when, in a Kevin Butler ad, Sony announced the PS3 Slim and the new pricing structure of $299 and $399, which is a far cry from the launch price of $499 and $599.
It's almost like they finally listened to the advice of a well-respected member of the community, scrapping what they had and relaunching new hardware with a new price. I'm just saying.
This new revision, and more importantly, this new price, coupled with the fantastic Kevin Butler ad campaign, was exactly what Sony needed, boosting the PS3 sales more than they had ever been. The Slim model was received very positively overall, with Eurogamer saying it's a product where the cost cutting has, by and large, been tastefully done, and that it's nothing short of a massive win for Sony. IGN gave the Slim revision a 9 out of 10, which is a definite improvement over ranking it 15th on their console ranking list a few years earlier in 2006. Also, around this time, Blu-ray had emerged as the victor over HD DVD in the format wars.
That sounds dramatic.
Making the inclusion of a Blu-ray player in all PS3s ultimately a good decision and boosting the overall value proposition of the console to the consumer. Sony also announced at E3 2009 that they would be releasing a motion controller called the PlayStation Move because, well, everybody else was because of the Wii. It later released in the latter part of 2010 and, well, you can't win them all. What you can call a win, though, is that during the 2010 E3 press conference, Gabe Newell made a live appearance recanting his previous statements due to Sony's move to make the PS3 more developer-friendly.
Funny how that happens when you follow sound advice.
The second half of the PS3's life is also when Sony began to release a bevy of very successful and well-received great games, such as sequels to the Uncharted series, God of War 3, Gran Turismo 5, The Last of Us, and many more. They really doubled down on quality exclusives, and it started to pay off.
The critical and commercial reception of the PS3 improved greatly over time, and their sales started to reflect this as they started to close the gap between themselves and the mighty 360. Not the Wii though, because that thing was like a freak of nature and nobody was getting near it.
Sony even released another Slim model revision in 2012, but that one wasn't received quite as well because it was kind of cheap. It gets the job done, but yeah, its build quality is definitely lacking. After all was said and done, the PS3 and Xbox 360 ended the generation about neck and neck. Sales reports for the generation are mixed, some claiming that in the end the PS3 outsold the 360 by about 2 million units, and some claiming the opposite. Finding concrete details on the subject is a bit difficult. As soon as you think you found them, you find something that says different.
Suffice to say that both consoles ended right around 80 million worldwide units sold, and that ain't too bad.
The one bit of concrete evidence that can be found, though, is that the Wii kicked the living shit out of both of them, ending its run at about 100 million units sold. So Sony had a pretty rough run in the 7th generation. They came into the game with an arrogant attitude, offering an overpriced and over-engineered piece of tech that didn't offer anything that its more affordable competition didn't. And because of this, and that they held on to those values for quite a while, they lost a tremendous amount of mindshare in the console space. Did they win the 7th generation? Well, no, they didn't. Nintendo did with the Wii. But against Microsoft did they win? As far as sales go, I don't know. Some say they did, some say they didn't. It was close either way. But sales aren't the only metric to look at, especially when they're that close. As far as mindshare goes, no, I don't think they did. The 360 won that by a long shot.
Hell, they possibly even won that battle against the Wii.
There's a reason that many people refer to the 7th generation as the 360 era, much like they refer to the 6th generation as the PS2 era, because it was the dominant console of the time. It's the console everybody thinks about when it comes to that time period, and like it or not, that's the case with the 7th generation as well.
Now, while Sony was able to bring it back around by the end, there were a lot of bad decisions and arrogant blunders with the PS3. So many so that I didn't want to bog everything down up to this point with them. But don't worry, we're gonna get to them with
the arrogant blunders. While the PlayStation 3 had its positives and successes, it definitely had a lot of blunders under its belt.
The decisions that Sony was making in the first half of the console's life were considerably bad, and they just kept making them. And it all began with the reveal of the console, which, while the system itself definitely featured an absurd amount of ports and features, there wasn't anything inherently bad at the time about it. But the new controller, on the other hand, well, that's another story.
The DualShock had been PlayStation's default controller since midway through the PS1's life, deriving its name from the dual analog thumbsticks and shocking rumble feature. It was a hit and fans loved it, and most assumed that the PS3's controller would have a similar form, all but wireless. Well, that's what we got for thinking, because the DualShock was not what we were presented with. Instead, we got something that looked like Batman dropped off one of his batarangs at Sony's R&D department, and somebody said,
"Now you want to get nuts? Come on, let's get nuts."
And the reception to this new controller design was not good. Not good at all. Like, people hated it and made fun of it to no end. In fact, the reception was so bad that a year later at the console's final form reveal, while the console more or less retained the same form factor, the controller adopted a more familiar form. It was the DualShock 2 with a home button and wireless. Now, this version of the controller was much better received. However, now people were complaining that Sony was just using the same controller over and over again and not innovating.
Man, you can't win for losing. But they were kind of right.
Either way, the overall perception of this new controller, dubbed the 6-axis, was much more positive, until people realized that the shock had been taken out of the Dual. That's right, the new state-of-the-art controller for this new state-of-the-art console was lacking what had become a basic assumed feature in consoles of the day: rumble. This could be one of the reasons that the name DualShock 3 wasn't used in favor of 6-axis. I don't know, but what we do know is that the reason that the controller itself didn't have rumble was due to a lawsuit that Sony was involved in, where they had been sued for violating patents by the tech company Immersion, the creators of the vibrotactile rumble tech in the PS1 and PS2 controllers. During this time, Sony was legally barred from using the tech in their products, hence the 6-axis. Now, regardless of the reasons, fans were not happy with the lack of haptic feedback, and honestly, the controller itself just came across as kind of flimsy without the weight of the rumble motors.
I always feel like I'm gonna break this thing.
Fortunately for Sony, they were able to work out a deal with Immersion where Sony was ordered to pay $22.5 million in licensing payments through 2009, plus an unspecified amount of fees and royalties.
Damn, that's some expensive rumble.
As a result of this, in late 2007, a year after the console's release, Sony released the DualShock 3, replacing the 6-axis as the default controller for the PS3, and it was pretty much the same exact controller as the 6-axis, but with rumble added back in. Better late than never, I guess. Jumping back to the original PS3 reveal real quick, to accompany the reveal, Sony also had some games to show off, one of which being a new gameplay trailer for Killzone 2. And if you saw this trailer for the time, you were blown away. I don't care what company you backed, what plastic box you had an allegiance to. You could hate Sony and PlayStation, but that gameplay trailer was awesome. And Sony was riding high on that thing for a while. But then some started calling into question the validity of the gameplay in this gameplay trailer.
You see, it was amazing, but that was the problem. It was a bit too amazing.
However, in the face of these accusations, Sony said no. It is real, it is gameplay, and only possible on the almighty PlayStation 3. And when outlets reached out to the developer, Guerrilla Games, they found that everything Sony had said was true.
Except for the part where it was gameplay, and that it was real, and yeah, it wasn't real. It was pre-rendered and essentially a CGI tech demo.
When the actual game came out, it wasn't a bad-looking game by any means, but it was nowhere near what that original trailer looked like. Now, to Guerrilla Games' credit, they claim that they never intended to present this trailer as gameplay because that's not what it was. That was all Sony's doing. So here's Sony with egg on their face. Again.
But maybe they'll learn from all these mistakes. Maybe their next big announcement will be much more thought out and in touch with their community. Yeah, their next big reveal was the price.
Now, I know we already touched on this earlier in the video, but when talking about Sony's blunders with the PS3, you have to talk about the price. Choosing to launch the console at $499 and $599 US respectively in 2006, $200 more than its competition in both cases, by the way, was Sony's arrogance and detachment from their audience on full display. On a side note, that's $740 and $887 in today's money, and for those of you that don't feel like mathing today, that's approximately $250 and $380 more than the most expensive PS5 at launch today.
Yes, Sony had lost their f***ing minds.
They thought that, hey, we'll throw a PlayStation logo on it and charge whatever the hell we want, and people will buy it, because we're Sony, bitch. Don't believe me? Well, some of the comments that Sony was officially making at this time include King Kutaragi, former chairman and CEO of Sony Interactive Entertainment and the father of the PlayStation, saying that the PS3 is going to be priced at a premium level, and that he wanted consumers to think to themselves, I will work more hours to buy one, and that it's a device consumers would be prepared to work overtime to afford.
Sure can. I bet they will.
Furthermore, Phil Harrison, president of Worldwide Studios at Sony Computer Entertainment, famously, or infamously, was quoted saying in response to the 360's launch and success that the HD era really only starts when we are on the market.
How'd that work out for you, Phil?
While there were a lot of different reasons that the 360 was outselling the PS3 in most regions, the price discrepancy is single-handedly the biggest of all. People just couldn't, understandably so, justify paying $600 for a console when you could literally buy two of their competitors' core consoles for that amount. Why no one at Sony ever said, hey guys, maybe that price is a bit too much. Maybe scale it back a bit. We'll never know.
I mean, they knew their main competitors' prices for at least a full year before even announcing their prices.
Why?
Now, all prices aside, upon the PS3's release in Japan, it seemed that it was quite the hit, moving, as mentioned earlier, almost 82,000 systems in the first 24 hours, which is really good for the region. But because there's always a but with the PlayStation 3, reports started to emerge that many of the initial systems were obtained by businessmen who paid mainly Chinese nationals to buy the systems to resell on eBay. And seeing as how they were only getting consoles and not buying any games, there ended up being more hardware units sold than games sold, putting the software attach rate of the console below 1% at launch in the region.
So while a sale's a sale, I guess, when most of those sales are going to scalpers, it kinda takes away from it a bit.
Also, not only was this generation the beginning of people losing their ever-living minds at console launches, it was the beginning of eBay scalpers buying up all the consoles before anyone could get their hands on them en masse, that we are still dealing with till this day. Now, once the console had been out for a while and it was more readily available, people started to notice something about the games, most specifically the multi-platform games. The PlayStation 3 is definitely more powerful than the Xbox 360. However, remember that whole not being very developer-friendly thing? Well, the results of that started to rear its ugly head pretty early on. Multi-platform games routinely looked, played, and just generally ran better on the 360. That's not to say that the games were all just broken on the PS3, but a lot of them did perform at least a bit better on the 360. That being said, some of them, such as The Elder Scrolls V, Skyrim, were just broken messes on the PS3. And this was a trend that continued through most of the console's life. Now, the exclusive, especially first-party games, looked fantastic, but being repeatedly outclassed by the 360 in the head-to-head multi-plat market was not a good look for Sony and their state-of-the-art console.
But hey, that HD era, it don't start till Sony arrives on the scene, right?
In 2009, with the release of the Slim model, Sony started to turn things around for the console. This was also the time that everybody was scrambling to emulate Nintendo's success with motion controls on the Wii by releasing their own motion control option, and Sony was no different. Releasing the PlayStation Move in late 2009, Sony's take on motion controls wasn't bad from a functionality perspective. Actually, it was extremely accurate, and I would go as far as to say that it is the most precise and accurate motion control option available at the time. Much like the PS3 itself, the tech was very solid and had a lot of potential. Granted, you looked like an idiot flailing around with these big stupid looking colored balls on sticks, but it worked. Problem was that Sony Sony'd this peripheral.
You see, Sony has a history of releasing really solid peripherals with great potential and then not doing with them. And the Move was no different.
There obviously was software for the Move, but none of it was very notable, and after a while it just kind of fell off the map and they didn't do anything with it. It would find a second life of sorts years later on the PS4 as a controller option for the PSVR, but that's another story for a different video. In 2007, reports started to crop up about an issue with the Xbox 360, whereas the console would overheat, rendering it unplayable. This would notoriously become known as the Red Ring of Death, aka the R-Rod. This was a major hit to Microsoft and honestly probably helped Sony out during this period. But what, you may be asking, does this have to do with the PlayStation 3 blunders? This sounds like a good thing from Sony's perspective. Well, while the R-Rod situation is very well known during the 7th generation, what's not talked about as much, at least at the time, was the PS3's Y-Lot, or the Yellow Light of Death.
Yes, the PlayStation 3 had its own Red Light of Death. It was just yellow.
While the original 360 hardware is lambasted as not being very high quality, understandably so, the PlayStation 3 original hardware ain't that great either. I will say that the original PS3's hardware usually takes a bit longer than the 360's to show its issues, but once they show up, oh boy, they are varied. There There is of course the Y-load that is similar to the 360's overheating issue, but there's also multiple Blu-ray drive issues, HDD corruption issues, HDMI failure issues, and a bevy of other smaller annoyances. Now if you had any of these issues and you contacted Sony, unless you were willing to pay, you were pretty much told, sorry about your luck. If you asked Sony, the Y-load issue wasn't anywhere near as widespread as the 360's R-Rod, which at the time, that would be correct. But over time, not so much. Finding an original PlayStation 3 in good working order that hasn't been repaired in 2024 is about as hard as finding an original Xbox 360 in good working order. These things were just not very well made. The technology in the box is good, but the build quality is just kinda crap.
Case in point, my perfectly preserved original PS3 that has been babied just randomly during the making of this video decided, for apparently no reason, your HDMI, and the HDMI encoder chip just stopped working.
Furthermore, during my console repair days, I can attest to the fact that OG PS3s are a monumental pain in the ass to work on.
So yeah, the 7th generation had some fantastic innovations in tech. Just shit original hardware.
By 2011, Sony had turned things around for the most part and was on the right track, enjoying the fruits of their labors. And then, on April 20th, 2011, the PlayStation Network was suddenly shut down.
But that's not totally out of the ordinary. Online networks go down for a few hours sometimes. Issues arise. Sometimes maintenance has to be done. But it didn't come back.
3 days later, on April 23rd, it was revealed that the service was down due to an external intrusion on the system. While at first, the severity of the situation was downplayed by Sony, almost 2 weeks later, on May 4th, it was revealed that the personal information of 77 million users might have been taken, including names, addresses, countries, email addresses, birth dates, logins, passwords, online IDs, and credit card information. So pretty much all the info. Oh yeah, and by might have been taken, they meant yeah, it absolutely was. To add insult to injury, and I mean like slapping your mom in front of you kind of insult, it later came out that Sony was aware of the severity of the hack much sooner than they had let on and waited to inform their customers.
Good job, Sony, facilitating the identity theft of over 77 million people because you're trying to save face.
It's like a little kid who breaks a window and doesn't tell their parent for fear of getting in trouble.
They're gonna find out.
All in all, the service was down for the better part of a month, coming back online on May 16th for some customers. Just to be clear, during that time, no online functionality could be accessed, including online profiles, some game save info, many of the system's features, any digital games because they require online authorizing, online multiplayer games, and some games in general just wouldn't run during the outage. Not to mention the whole having your identity stolen thing. This was not a good look for Sony, again, and their customer base was unhappy, again. However, Sony did at least attempt to soften the blow this time around by offering a welcome back program, which included 2 free downloadable PS3 games, 30 days free membership of PlayStation Plus for all PSN members,
Though after all that mess, they may not want that.
and most ironically funny of all, a free 1-year enrollment in an identity theft protection program.
I mean, it may not seem like much considering the mess, but seeing as how they had dealt with other messes with the console at this point, I guess I'll take it. Not that you really had a choice.
Suffice to say, the PS3 had a whole lot of blunders, and most of those are rooted in outright bad decisions on Sony's part, due largely to complacency and an arrogance that developed from, one assumes, being in the top spot for so long. While I detailed many of the larger issues here, there were more, but I think these do a more than adequate job of illustrating the state of Sony at the time. The fact that Sony had become complacent and disconnected and then made bad decisions early on isn't the most egregious part. That's actually somewhat understandable. No, it's the fact that they kept on making bad decisions, taking years before they were able to right the ship, and even then, they still had their issues.
Fortunately, they were able to right that ship, for the most part, and continue on to a more consumer-friendly model moving forward. Until the current generation. But whatever, that's a story for another day. One of the biggest things they did to improve the PS3 was that they started to focus on something that we haven't touched on in detail thus far. We're gonna change that though as we talk about the main reason we buy a console to begin with.
The games. A whopping total of approximately 2,500 games were released for the PS3 across all regions. Surprisingly, while its successor, the PS4, is known for its exclusives, the PS3 actually has more exclusive titles, with about 300 that are only available on the platform.
While it took a little while for it to really pick up steam, there are some fantastic titles for the console. And while I won't go through them all here, this video is already long enough, some of the more popular highlights would be
Killzone 2 and 3, Sony's premier first-person shooter at the time, Killzone 2 is the sequel to the PS2's so-called Halo killer Killzone. While the original Killzone was received fairly well, Killzone 2 upped the ante in every category. It looked great,
Though maybe not as great as that trailer.
sounded great, played great, and most importantly was just a really fun experience. The story's a bit lackluster, but overall the game is an exciting great time. The sequel, Killzone 3, is on the PS3 as well, and was good, but didn't quite live up to 2's greatness. Ridge Racer 7.
Ridge Racer!
7. If you've ever played Ridge Racer, then you know what to expect here. Arcade drift racing with flashy graphics. If you like Ridge Racer, then you'll like this one. It's not the deepest racer ever created, but it is solid, good fun that's pretty damn easy on the eyes too. The Valve games. The Orange Box, aka one of the best damn deals in gaming, consists of 5 Valve games in one. The crazy popular multiplayer shooter Team Fortress 2, what's considered as one of the greatest games ever made, Half-Life 2, its 2 expansions, Episode 1 and 2, and the then new puzzle game, Portal. All of these games are of the highest caliber and fantastic, but by far my favorite would be Portal. Portal alone makes this package worth it. While you should definitely check out Half-Life 2 and its expansions, Portal is like nothing else you've ever played. Until this day remains one of the best puzzle games available. A few years later, we got Portal 2, and it did exactly what a sequel is supposed to do. It expanded upon every aspect of the first game, and in my humble opinion is, bar none, the best puzzle game ever created by a long shot. Yes, it is that good, and you're doing yourself a disservice if you haven't experienced it. The Ratchet & Clank Future series. Third-person shooting platforming at its best, the story is lacking but the gameplay is solid, though at times it does throw a bit too much at the player. All that being said, you'd be hard-pressed to find a better shooter platformer with a better pace. The games, which there are 4 of, keep you engaged from beginning to end, and are great entries in the overall series. The MotorStorm series. The first MotorStorm was used heavily in the PS3's original marketing, and for good reason. It's a damn good looking game. An over-the-top arcade combat racer where the environment is as much of a threat as the other drivers, MotorStorm is a fun, good looking game, though the experience is kind of short and bare bones. Its sequels, Pacific Rift and Apocalypse, both refine the good and improve upon the lacking, adding more content, making for a better experience overall, with the second game, Pacific Rift, being the best in my opinion. The Last of Us. Debatably Sony's most well-known exclusive property, pretty much everybody is at least aware of The Last of Us. It's seen as one of the greatest games ever made, spawning multiple remasters, a sequel, and a very well-made and received TV show. The gameplay is really solid, but the star of the show here is the narrative, which is extremely cinematic, hits you in the feels when it counts, and is overall just pretty great. Now all that being said, I feel like the game starts with an amazing bang that hits you hard, but in my opinion, never quite gets back to that level. It is a good game for sure, but I do feel like it's one of the most overhyped games in existence. That's probably gonna ruffle some feathers, but that's just my personal opinion. Overhyped or not though, The Last of Us is still a fantastic game that is absolutely worth your time. Infamous 1 and 2. The first Infamous is an awesome open-world superhero simulator that faces you with choices that actually do make a difference in the world that you're playing in, with consequences that you'll have to deal with. More importantly, the game actually makes you feel like a superpowered badass, more so than any other game up to that point. There's a few performance hitches here or there, and the story's hit or miss, but the world, missions, and gameplay are top-notch, delivering one of the best open-world experiences of the generation. The sequel, Infamous 2, takes what the first game did and improves upon it in pretty much every way, though it doesn't really innovate in any particular category like its forebear, leaving it feeling a bit samey. That's not to say that it's a bad game, it's actually pretty great, but don't expect to be as blown away by this one as you were with the first. Overall, 2 great games that deserve your attention. Heavenly Sword. While not developer Ninja Theory's first game, Heavenly Sword is the game that put them on the map. A fantastic looking, extremely cinematic third-person hack and slash with light puzzle elements and a pretty good story. Unfortunately, the gameplay is kinda bland though. It all works, but it's just not too exciting and the encounters become boring fast. There's a ton of God of War-esque QTEs that are stupid fast and require a lot of trial and error as a result, robbing the game of some of its fluidity and excitement. Ninja Theory was headed in the right direction, but execution-wise didn't quite hit the mark. Not a terrible game, but also not one you need to rush out and play either. Enslaved: Odyssey to the West. A retelling of the classic Chinese story Journey to the West, Enslaved is Ninja Theory's follow-up to Heavenly Sword, and man did they get it right this time around. Playing out as a third-person cinematic hack-and-slash platformer, this game is awesome. The story, the look, the gameplay, the world, everything is just intriguing and unique, and it's really fun to play to boot.
Imagine that, a game with fun gameplay.
With some truly exciting set pieces, such as the entire beginning level where you're trying to escape a crashing airship as it crumbles around you, this game is one of the most underrated best experiences you can have in the 7th generation. Sadly, nobody bought the game, so many aren't even aware of its existence, but take it from me, this game is fantastic and will stay with you for years after completing it. Gran Turismo 5. It's Gran Turismo, and if you like Gran Turismo, then you'll like Gran Turismo 5. Seen by many as one of the best entries in the series, GT5 throws a metric ton of content at the player, offering more of just about everything. Many saw it as a return to form for the series after 3 and 4 were met with some criticisms concerning innovation, or lack thereof. GT5 became the second best-selling game on the platform and the best-selling PS3 exclusive on the platform. While casual arcade racing fans will have a bit of a harder time with this one, sim racing fans will be in heaven, because as far as sim racers go, on consoles at least, GT is a hard act to follow. Persona 5. Okay, so I gotta admit something here. I've never played a Persona game. Now for the two of you that hung around for the rest of the video, Persona 5, an extremely late release on the console, is seen by many as the best JRPG ever created. I recently tried out P5 and holy crap, the energy that this game exudes. While I haven't put a lot of time into the game yet, I can say that I will be. P5 has one of the most unique visual styles around, an extremely creative and interesting, so far, story, and the turn-based battles are some of the most hectic, over-the-top, throw everything in the world up on the screen entertaining affairs I've ever experienced. Turn-based battles, while fun, are usually slower, more methodical affairs, but Persona 5's turn-based battles are insanely over-the-top, fast, exciting, overflowing with energy battles that never disappoint. It's obvious very quickly after booting this one up why it's held in such high regard. Not just worth checking out, but required. Demon Souls. Masochist, the game, Demon Souls is the granddaddy of the Souls-like genre. The original Get Good game, Demon Souls is purposely one of the hardest modern games ever created. You will die. A lot. This game is not for everybody, but those that want the ultimate challenge and the extremely gratifying reward that goes along with that challenge love Demon Souls to no end. The gothic atmosphere and the world are great, and you gotta respect the game for not ever relenting on its premise. This game is hard, but if you stick with it, you will get better, and it is one of the most rewarding games ever set to a disc. So if rethinking your life choices sounds like a good time to you, then check out Demon Souls. Dark Souls 1 and 2. The successor to Demon Souls, Dark Souls is everything Demon Souls was, but somehow harder. And when I say harder, I mean utterly sadistic at times. And while that might sound like absolute insanity, From Software apparently knows what its audience wants, because the fans of Demon Souls loved Dark Souls. Take everything I said about Demon Souls, paste it here, and say harder. And a little bit prettier. The sequel, Dark Souls 2, showed up a few years later, and while received fairly well, most considered the first to be a bit better. Me myself, I'm more of an Elden Ring fan, but for those of you that love Dark Souls, I get it. If you're a Souls-like fan, Dark Souls is your magnum opus, and you don't need me to tell you to play this because you already have. The Resistance series. Resistance 1, 2, and 3 are the epitome of how to do a great FPS. The first game was an awesome shooter that had fun as hell gameplay, good storytelling, and an interesting world and enemies that are reminiscent of the Gears of War franchise, and no, that is not an insult. Each game in the series improved upon the last in meaningful ways, with the third in particular leaning into the story more than ever before. Why this series hasn't continued on beyond 2 portable games around the same time, I will never know. Think of how awesome a new Resistance game could be today, but unfortunately that doesn't seem like it's ever going to happen, seeing as how the developer, Insomniac, said that after the third game they had no interest or intention of making any more Resistance games. It was reported that in 2021 a sequel was pitched to Sony, but Sony rejected it, so RIP Resistance, you were great while you lasted. Go play them now, by the way. The Uncharted series. If you put Indiana Jones in a modern Tomb Raider game, you'd get the Uncharted series. I didn't have a PS3 in the 7th generation. At the time, there just wasn't anything it was offering that I could justify the purchase for. But I will admit, the Uncharted games were the games that almost made that happen. And when I finally did get one years later, they were the first games I got. The Uncharted games have awesome fun gameplay, exciting stories, amazing set pieces, great characters, and are just overall fun and memorable as hell. The first game is a little rough by comparison,
Especially that gun combat. Whew, that was crap.
but the overall experience carries you through. Uncharted 2 Among Thieves is better in every conceivable way and the pinnacle of the Uncharted games. This game is awesome. I would be hard-pressed to find much of anything wrong with it. It's that good. The third game, Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception, doesn't quite live up to the second game, but it's still an awesome time and you're selling yourself short if you don't give this series a go. Warhawk. A quasi-remake/reboot of the overlooked and forgotten PS1 game of the same name, Warhawk is a solid-as-hell multiplayer shooter where huge team battles take place on the ground and in the air. The game looks good, feels great, and does what it does really well. Unfortunately, the originally planned single-player campaign never materialized, which really sucks because I was hoping for more of those super cheesy FMV cutscenes from the original game that looked like something straight out of Captain Power and the Soldiers of the Future.
If you know, you know.
Also, the game doesn't even include bots of any kind, so multiplayer is your only option, and those servers were shut down quite a while back. Split screen is possible through a clunky method, but it's just not the same. Due to the online nature of the game, it's more or less unplayable in the current day, which is sad because this was a pretty cool experience. SOCOM 4. The SOCOM series was at one time the premier shooter on the PlayStation platform, peaking in the PS2 era. SOCOM 4 was an attempt to regain that glory in the modern era, but what we ended up with was an overall generic experience with a lackluster story, okay but uneven graphics, an online experience that works but doesn't do anything particularly great, and a single-player campaign that lacks any real excitement. It's okay, but much like Warhawk, the servers were shut down a long time ago, and without online multiplayer, it's kind of useless. Sonic the Hedgehog. What was meant to be a rebooted new beginning for the Blue Blur, Sonic the Hedgehog, or Sonic 06 as it's commonly referred to, was a disaster of a game. It's remembered as one of, if not the worst Sonic games ever produced, and for good reason. For every good decision the developers made for the game, two more are waiting around the corner to trip it up and kick it while it's down. A weird story, and not in a good way, bad missions and mission structure, frustratingly terrible controls, especially the camera, and a bevy of glitches, this game was just broken. Now that being said, there actually is a good game in here. It's just impossible to get to through all the BS. This one is not worth any of your time, no matter how much of a Sonic fan you are. On a side note, there is a fan remake or retooling of the game called Sonic P06 that rights all the wrongs so you can see how good the game could have been that's available on PC, and that version is actually pretty great, but not official. God of War 3. The conclusion to the classic God of War series, God of War 3 is the best in the series in my humble opinion. It retains the same high level of quality that the series had become known for, but made everything just better. I really enjoyed God of War 1 and 2, but 3 is on another level. The excitement of this game starts at the very beginning and never lets up, taking on a more cinematic approach, but not at the expense of the gameplay. Every level is fresh and fun, and each boss encounter is memorable as hell. Unlike its predecessors, there's no that one level that's a drag. Every level, every step of the journey, every moment in God of War 3 is excellent. Okay, so the ending is a little vague and we could have done with a bit more there, but everything else is top tier through and through, a must play. Twisted Metal. An attempt to bring the iconic series to the modern era, Twisted Metal gets a lot right, such as its single-player variety with multiple different stories, great graphics, great mix of licensed music that fits the world, and the feel of the world and vehicles is spot on. Now while I appreciate the story being there, it is weak as hell, but Twisted Metal is a multiplayer game through and through, and it does that really well. Or should I say, it did that really well. Because, like the other multiplayer-focused games on this list, its servers were shut down a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. So that mode is all but defunct. This was unfortunately the last in the series, though rumors of another reboot have circulated for years. It's worth checking out for the single player, but don't pay a lot for it. The Little Big Planet series. A physics-based platformer, Little Big Planet is a very unique experience with hours upon hours of content. The single-player mode is definitely fun, but the creator mode is where the game really shines. The sequels never quite lived up to the original's greatness in my opinion, but overall, it's a solid, dependable, great series that you can't help but have a smile on your face while you play. Check this one out and thank me later. The Elder Scrolls, Oblivion, and Skyrim. The Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion is a fantastic game, and as a bonus, due to the game coming out so much later than its other versions, you get some of the DLC included here. It's a little hitchy here and there, but that might not necessarily be the PS3's fault and just the Bethesda-ness of it all. A great port of one of the best games around. The Elder Scrolls 5 Skyrim is a fantastic game as well, one of the best games ever made, some would say. However, the PS3 port of Skyrim was a broken mess. It's plagued with glitches, performance issues, and absolutely terrible frame rate, muddy textures, and game-breaking bugs specific to the platform. The worst of all is the save game file glitch that will destroy the game and possibly even your console itself. There's bad ports, and then there's Skyrim on PS3. Possibly the worst port of any game ever. Absolutely give Oblivion a go, and definitely give Skyrim a shot too if you haven't already. Just do it on a different platform. Haze. Marketed as the Halo killer, Haze was not that. A first-person sci-fi shooter where the player uses a drug called Nectar to gain momentary abilities and has to struggle with the drawbacks to using such a narcotic, Haze had potential. It just didn't capitalize on any of that potential. While it had a neat idea with the drug mechanic, the execution just doesn't work very well. The gameplay is stiff and uninspired, the graphics are bland and lacking overall, the story is weak as hell, and the characters are laughably bad to an annoying degree. Haze is just a bad game and unfortunately not worth anyone's time. Journey. Journey is one of those extremely unique titles that comes around every few generations. It has a beautiful art style and plays unlike anything else. It's a simple game, but it's more about the experience, and what an experience it is. It's not long, in fact it's pretty short, but it should be experienced by all. The story is conveyed through the gameplay and world, but it's more impactful than the stories in most games today. It has a compelling approach to co-op that integrates itself into the single-player game and only adds to the experience. Originally a digital-only title, it later received a physical release packaged with the equally unique Flower and Flow, and is absolutely worth a pickup. This is one that will stick with you for a long time after completion. Grand Theft Auto 5. The best-selling game on the platform and the third best-selling game of all time, GTA 5 is one of the biggest, most recognizable games today. There's not much I can really tell you here. It's GTA. You know it, you probably love it, and you don't need me to tell you if you need to get it or not, because based on those sales numbers, you probably already have. Metal Gear Solid 4: Guns of the Patriots. MGS4 is the end of the Metal Gear Solid story. You once again play as Solid Snake for some stealth action, though some claim that the game has been made too easy, focusing more on the action than the series' traditional stealth. Admittedly, the series wasn't for me at the time, but those who love it, and there are legions, love MGS4, so if you're a Metal Gear Solid fan, you're probably gonna like Metal Gear Solid 4. I will say that the game is absolutely gorgeous, if not a bit gray, but that was the style at the time. It's also one of the most sought-after titles in the series due to it being the only game in the series that hasn't been ported to any other platform. So if you want to play this one, you have to get a PS3. By all accounts, it's a great entry that brings the epic series to an end, until part 5 at least, but that one's pretty divisive. The Eco and Shadow of the Colossus HD Collection. Two of the most acclaimed games of the PS2 era in one package, in HD no less. What's not to like? Eco doesn't hold up quite as well all these years later, and is pretty much a big escort level, but it's still a hell of an experience with an intriguing story in a wonderful world. Shadow of the Colossus, on the other hand, holds up great till this day and is one of the best games of the generation. It's still a good looking game with a gorgeous art style, some of the best boss levels you'll ever experience, and an ending that will hit you hard. This is the best way to experience these games and a must-buy for any PS3 owner. Lair. Lair was supposed to be one of the platform's early big exclusives that would showcase what the console was capable of. It looks great, has a cool world with dragons that you ride around on engaging in epic battles, an entertaining story, and a production value that couldn't be matched at the time. Unfortunately, it ended up more of a showcase for the 6-axis controller than the console itself, and it wasn't quite as successful at that as they would have liked. Including 6-axis motion controls in the game is fine. Forcing the player to use the motion controls throughout the entire game, though, ruins the experience, especially since the motion controls aren't very well implemented. The game seems like it could be really fun, but the controls utterly tank the experience, making it more frustrating than it's worth. The Mass Effect series. When you talk about the best video game series of all time, Mass Effect has to be part of the conversation. One of my top 3 favorite game series of all time. The first was an exclusive to the Xbox 360 until 2012 when it was ported to the PS3. A Western RPG sci-fi epic from the creators of Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic and Jade Empire, there's not a bad entry in the trilogy.
We don't talk about Andromeda.
The second is seen as the best of the series, and I gotta say, Part 2 is pretty damn awesome. Part 1 is a bit different and not quite as refined as its sequels. I love that about it though, but it's still an absolutely fantastic game with debatably the best story in video game history. The third game, while fantastic, has one of the most divisive endings in video game history, with most leaning to the negative side of things, but the overall experience is second to none. If you play only one set of games on this list, you're selling yourself short if you don't experience the amazingness of the Mass Effect trilogy. Best game series ever made? One of them for sure. The Quantic Dream games. Do you like movies? Do you also have a passing interest in video games? If you answered yes to both of those, then Heavy Rain and Beyond Two Souls might be for you. More like interactive movies than games, the narrative and presentation in Heavy Rain and Beyond are the order of the day. Not a lot of gameplay here, but there is some impressive tech, and the narratives are unique and interesting, we'll say. At times, said narratives tend to get a bit out there and become a bit full of themselves and pretentious, but the quality and uniqueness of these games can't be denied. They're kind of like the new evolution of the FMV games from the 90s. If nothing else, Quantic Dream's games are, as always, a technical showcase for the console. Not for everybody, but definitely worth giving a shot.
The PlayStation 3's library is full of some great exclusives, and some great, if not flawed at times, multiplats. And while I touched on many of them here, there are many more worth checking out. Is there a game that you love that wasn't on this list? Well, let us know in the comments below so we can all experience it. Looking back at the PlayStation 3, most see it as a stumbling point in PlayStation's mostly stellar track record.
In most circles, the astronomical price is seen as the reason for this, but as we've seen here, while yes, the price definitely played a big part in the PS3's stumbles in the first half of its life, there were many bad decisions and blunders that led to Sony's least popular console. Many of these issues derived from an arrogance and disconnect Sony had with their audience. The price, being difficult to develop for, janky original hardware, lesser versions of multi-platform releases, the handling of a system intrusion that resulted in 77 million people's personal information being compromised, overall bad decisions, the list goes on and on. Fortunately though, they were able to turn things around, though it took them a long while, with a better hardware revision, great marketing campaigns, releasing a string of fantastic games in the second half of its life, and ultimately being a bit humbled and not taking their customers for granted anymore.
They took a hell of a hit, and Sony learned a lesson from the 7th generation. In retrospect, I like the PS3, and I think it offers a lot of interesting, unique games and powerful hardware.
It has its quirks, and Sony's overall attitude towards its consumer base during this generation really rubs me the wrong way. However, I will say that while its successor, the PS4, would definitely have greater success, the PS3 had a distinct personality that Sony's later endeavors seem to have lost.
The 7th generation was when we saw Sony at their worst, but we also saw them at their best. They took their competition and their customer base for granted, and as a result, for the first time, they were forced to really try, delivering greatness in the process.
But after all is said and done, it is a neat system that offers a ton of great exclusives that are absolutely worth checking out.
Did Sony learn their lesson for the next generation? Yes, absolutely. What they did with the next generation was in stark contrast to the 7th. Did they learn their lesson long term? Well, some would say no, but that's debatable, and only time will tell. But in the meantime, I'll be looking back and playing Beyond with the PlayStation 3. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the PlayStation 3 and its journey beyond arrogance. I hope you enjoyed my in-depth look at the PS3. If you like this, then check out my story of the Nintendo 64 right here. and other videos on my channel right here. I want to say thanks to all my patrons out there. Without you guys' support, videos like this would not be possible. If you want to support the channel, consider hitting the like and subscribe button. Or if you want to do a bit more, you can join my Patreon and enjoy exclusive benefits. However you go about it, I appreciate you being here, and until next time, you're beautiful, you're awesome, and I love absolutely every last one of you. Thanks for watching.